with over 13 years of experience at a diverse range of companies, from startups like SpaceX and Rivian to Fortune 500 companies. Our guest has helped companies eliminate chaos by balancing demand and supply over the years. She has a proven track record of delivering measurable results, including reducing forecast errors and cutting lead times. It's my pleasure to welcome her today, Lindsay Vollmer. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you for having me.
You're my first female guest, so I'm pretty excited about that. But I know we addressed it a little bit before the podcast, but have you seen that there is lesser females to males ratio, or is it more that we don't really have them in the leadership roles, I guess?
Yeah, I do notice a lot of the companies I've worked at and for are in aerospace.
What are the most common misconceptions you have seen over the years? I've worked for so many companies implementing SOP.
Yeah, I think a big misconception is...
And you work for SpaceX, so how's that experience been? Because obviously everybody is interested in understanding the space world. It's so like there's not a lot of information out there of how the operations and supply and demand, all of that works. How do you approach that? I would love to hear an example from that company.
So SpaceX is in a lot of the space companies now. There's a lot of uncertainty in the demand.
And I'm pretty sure there are different types of key levers when you're talking about forecasting and the errors behind it. According to you, what are the top three that you should always look for when you're trying to reduce the forecast error for the future? Welcome, everyone, to the Vserve Ebusiness Solutions podcast on supply chain management, where we invite some of the industry's great experts to share their experiences and gather some helpful tips along the way. I'm Cynthia, your host, and today we are joined by an expert in sales and operations planning with over 13 years of experience at a diverse range of companies, from startups like SpaceX and Rivian to Fortune 500 companies. Our guest has helped companies eliminate chaos by balancing demand and supply over the years. She has a proven track record of delivering measurable results, including reducing forecast errors and cutting lead times. It's my pleasure to welcome her today, Lindsay Vollmer. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we were having this discussion and I want to kind of get it off the bat. Tell us how it started. I know supply chain management isn't really the first thing people look for, but sales, operations, 13 plus years in fields. How did you get there? How's the journey been? Get us started.
Yeah, so I first learned what sales and operations planning was in my first job as a demand forecasting analyst. For those that don't know at a high level, it's a monthly process where you balance your demand, supply, financial goals, and you're really looking at that 1.5 to 3 year planning horizon. So it's that medium term planning horizon. Most companies do a corporate strategic planning horizon of like 5, maybe even 10 years. And then you have your daily execution, your annual execution. But this process really is about that middle ground and looking at where your supply risks are and reducing those. I first learned about it in my first job. Ever since I learned about it, I was like, this is definitely what I want to do. I fell in love with it immediately. It's very cross-functional. You have to know a little bit about what's going on in each function. So I love that. And then you have to work with a lot of different people, not only in different functions, but also up and down the org. You're working with people on the production floor, engineers and engineering managers, and then all the way up to the VP of sales, the CEO, the C-suite. So I love that aspect of it as well. So yeah, I really just fell in love with everything about it.
Perfect. And it's so rare because we've been doing this podcast for the past few weeks now. And you're my first female guest. So I'm pretty excited about that. But I know we addressed it a little bit before the podcast, but have you seen that there is lesser females to males ratio, or is it more that we don't really have them in the leadership roles, I guess?
Yeah, I do notice a lot of the companies I've worked at and for are in aerospace. A lot of the leadership teams, especially the C-suite, is male. I for sure see females in all levels of leadership, especially below the C-suite. I've definitely noticed the disparity, but I also see a lot of females, which I love. I also may just be looking for them. But I think you can be successful as a female in operations. It's just historically been a more predominantly male field. So that's probably why we
Yeah.
still see that. Hopefully in the future we'll see more CEOs and
Yeah.
things that are female. Yeah.
Perfect. I know our Vserve COO is also a female, so I always look up to her in that terms. But it is a very demanding job, and obviously there's a lot of misconception about how people implement S&OP. What are the most common misconceptions you have seen over the years? I've worked for so many companies implementing SOP.
Yeah, I think a big misconception is that it's a middle management process. So sometimes I'll see where the executive team, they're kind of hands off and they're like, yeah, this sounds great. We need this and you
Yeah.
guys handle it. You really need that executive level support. You need them paying attention and understanding because as part of the process, you'll some point be escalating decisions and things that need discussed and decisions that need made to the
Mhm.
executive team. So they really need to be in there understanding all of the data that we're using, asking questions about it, engaged in the meetings in order
Right.
for it to be effective. I think one of the other misconceptions is that the teams that you already have are going to have the right skills and the right tools to run this process. So sometimes it's a kind of logical flow to say, well, we do currently look weekly at what our supply constraints are and what materials do we need on the floor this week. And so we have the tools to do that. So why wouldn't we just expand that out into looking at the next year and a half to 3 years?
Yeah.
And it's not always the same tool set. You don't always have the data rigor to see information out that far. So that's one of the misconceptions. And then skills wise, since it is so cross functional and
Mhm.
data driven, you really need people in each of the key functions: sales, marketing, operations, supply chain, procurement, planning, production planning,
Mhm.
and then in finance. You need somebody in each of those functions that is
Right.
more data driven and data minded and knows data analytics in order for the process to function properly. You need not just the data analysis, but someone with good communication skills to facilitate the
Mhm.
process. Sometimes I see that a company doesn't already have those things in place, and so they'll really struggle to run the process.
Yeah. So it's pretty much the whole company has to be involved within the process because it's like from
Most,
front to
yeah.
end. Yeah.
Sometimes there will be companies that have products they've run for a long time, and maybe engineering doesn't need to be involved because we already have the data we need from them and the other teams
Yeah.
understand the data. But for a lot of the companies that I've worked with, which are very like technical products, advanced manufacturing, you're constantly designing. Engineering's highly involved in the new products coming out. So you need them in the process. So it kind of
Mhm.
depends on the maturity of the company.
Yeah. And you worked for SpaceX. So how's that experience been? Because obviously everybody is interested in understanding the space world. It's so like there's not a lot of information out there of how the operations and supply and demand, all of that works. How do you approach that? I would love to hear an example from that company.
So SpaceX is in a lot of the space companies now. There's a lot of uncertainty in the demand and in the supply. It's very challenging to balance.
Yeah.
At SpaceX, I was one of the first master schedulers. They started their master scheduling team while I was there. I started in 2016. And from 2015, there were around 7 launches. And then last year, it was something like 138. So it was like almost a 20x
Yeah.
increase, right? So it
Yeah.
was crazy growth and very challenging to balance demand and supply. I was there in that beginning high growth stage.
Mhm.
And as part of that first master scheduling team, I remember building a really simple Excel tool that looked at our backlog. We had a long backlog. We could see out what do we need to build in
Yeah.
the next year and a half to 2 years.
Yeah.
But because we had a bunch of different configurations, different designs for each
Mhm.
of those major rocket assemblies, and
Yeah.
things were constantly changing and being iterated on as we flew something,
Yeah.
that engineering team would figure out that needed to be redesigned. So you can't buy too much too
Exactly.
soon because you just have a bunch of obsolete
Mhm.
inventory. So there was an Excel tool that I built that looked at our master schedule based on our backlog out a year and a half to 2 years. What is our general cumulative lead time for all of those configurations we need to build? Meaning, how long do we think it's going to take to build internally based on our goals of getting faster at production. That lead time changes as you go into the future. Also, what is our procurement lead time for the longest key materials? Laying all of that out and then layering on top the reuse piece. SpaceX also is very challenging demand supply wise because you fly on the rocket and then they come back and they need some maintenance. They maybe need some new parts, but you're not building an entirely new assembly. There's reuse. I remember this tool that I built because we were at the very beginning stages, right? There was just nothing there for that. I was able to rearrange the master schedule in our ERP system and push out like $8 million worth of inventory we were going to buy that year, but we didn't actually need to buy based on including all of those different factors of lead time changes, reuse. I think along those lines with high uncertainty, it's really valuable for those companies to understand what are the key product groups that are key to our strategy. Maybe it's a new product we're going to implement next year. It actually is a higher margin product. And so we're going to really focus on that once we launch it. And these other products we're currently running are going to be phased out. A lot of companies, especially startups, sometimes startups, will not be great at that communication. Sometimes they are great, but it kind of depends. If your company isn't really great at letting everyone below the C-suite know those strategies, that's a great starting point for the S&OP. Understand of those key product groups that are key to your strategy in the future. What are the major supply constraints that you have? Is it machinery that in order to unlock additional capacity for that growth, we need to add more machines? Is it people? Just understanding at a really high level what those things are and then their timelines is really valuable. So it doesn't need to be overly complicated. Obviously, you want to have as much data as possible. You can make better decisions, but you need to make sure that data is maintained, and also forecasting at a high growth company is really, really hard. It goes a long way to know those high level things and track high level milestones of when do we need to make certain decisions about supply buy and run it that way.
And start as easy as an Excel sheet. So that's fascinating. And it's so great to hear these examples because I'm pretty sure the people who are watching would love to understand how these things work. And, I'm pretty sure there are different types of key levers when you're talking about forecasting and the errors behind it. According to you, what are the top 3 that you should always look for when you're trying to reduce the forecast error for the future?
Yeah. I think one of those things is aligning your demand and supply processes. When we think about balancing demand and supply, we're thinking, do we have enough materials and people and the capacity to build the things that our customer wants at the same time they want it, right? And we also want to think about the process in that way. When you're demand forecasting, you might need to get down to a regional level. I remember forecasting for insulation and it was applied regionally because there are factories across the United States. One factory would supply multiple states and you wanted to keep it that way to keep your transportation costs low. So it's really key to keep costs low, to have more accurate demand and supply, to forecast at that regional level as well. Your supply is regional, so you should also forecast regionally. And I remember that switch in that process really increased our forecast accuracy by 10 or 11%. So that's one key thing, is to make your demand and supply process more aligned as much as possible. And then one other key really is to actually talk to your salespeople, to have sales and operations talking. Right? Which is why sales and planning is great, because you may have a bunch of information that your sales team is managing, right? They may have an amazing CRM system. They may have an amazing spreadsheet and they track all of this information. But when you go to look at it to see, could we supply this forecast, and say they even have an amazingly accurate forecast, they might be talking in different part numbers that operations has no idea what that means because it's a customer part number. Or maybe they don't actually track the lead time they're committing to a customer. And so there's disparities between what they promise versus what we can actually deliver. So that the communication and understanding from sales and the operations side, operations understanding sales and how they capture their information, and then vice versa, sales understanding their key operational levers. If they know it takes 2 years to add certain machines for
Yeah.
us to increase capacity on a certain product group, then they know that if they know those products are potentially, there's discussions about higher demand, they're going to go immediately to operations to let them know. So really that communication is key.
Yeah. And everybody knows like sales and operations is like they're like enemies of each other when it comes to
Mhm.
information sharing in most companies. So understanding how to get them aligned is very important. And I've worked with a lot of companies where we had to go back and forth with this information. So how do you align with these cross-functional teams? And I'm not just talking sales and operations. There's finance, there's so many different areas, even within operations, sales, marketing, everybody when you're starting like S&OP from scratch,
Mhm.
how does that help? What are like the things you do to help them align in that same page?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's all about the people, right? So
Mhm.
you're going to have different people, different personalities.
Yep.
Definitely helps in what I was describing before of like sales understanding operations. You don't need to
Mhm.
know everything, but understand a little about operations and vice versa. Same thing with finance. Operations, a master scheduler, for example, or somebody who's setting the tone for production or inventory we're going to buy, whatever kind of
Mhm.
business you have, that person understanding how does finance use this information to forecast
Yeah.
revenue. That's just really helpful
Yeah.
because the more people understand each other, even just a little bit, the
Yeah.
more they'll be quick and smarter to say, I know this is up and this thing is happening, this change is happening in my function, and I'm going
Mhm.
to let my finance person know right away. So I think that cross-functional training and understanding is really important. And when it comes to implementing S&OP from scratch, usually we'll have a mix of people that have been in more formal S&OP process and some that have no idea what that even means, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, having everybody cross-functionally from different functions, finance, sales, production, all in the same room, getting trained and being able to ask questions, that's a team building experience in itself. Incorporating cross-functional teams into what does this process look like for us?
Yeah.
Every company has a different product. Every company has a different strategy for inventory, or maybe they're not even a production company. They just buy their inventory and resell it. So every company has slightly different metrics or discussion points that they care about.
Mhm. Yeah.
And it's really important that you have the people that are going to be involved in the process from all the functions coming together to talk about what do they want to see in it? What
Yeah.
would be helpful for them? Because ultimately, this is a process that initially a lot of people will be like, this is just adding more work for me and I
Yeah.
hate it. And
Yeah.
that is totally normal. And that happens every time. But what we want is that over time, you're not firefighting as much. You're not spending your weeks being like, oh, this material is short and we didn't know, or last minute we've got to expedite with a supplier because we're learning that next month we're ramping up production. These sorts
Mhm.
of things are just a headache and something you don't want your people to be having to do all the time. It's just very inefficient. Ultimately, like having those cross-functional teams and people actually involved in the design of the process, what do they want to see? What are their pain points that they think could get better through it? That is really helpful for building teamwork cross-functionally. Some companies are really great at and some are not. At the executive level, if they're working cross-functionally together, then
Yeah.
that's usually the only example that you need because people see that. People pay attention.
At a
If
leadership
you're
level.
in operations and your VP of ops is always complaining about sales, then probably over time you're eventually going to be always complaining about sales. So
Yeah.
that really
Definitely.
helps when the executive team kind of portrays that
Yeah.
teamwork mentality as well.
Definitely, leadership has a lot of role in this when it comes to
Yeah.
people and how they perceive it. This whole process of S&OP is so vast, right? There's so many different layers to it. There's so many different people attached to the process. Over the 13 years, you've had to implement some of the stuff in-house versus leveraging external partner or outsource analytics to save money, do a little bit more efficient work, to have those back office support given outside versus in-house. How do you implement those different areas within the SOP circle?
Outsourcing versus not outsourcing. I would say your longer term goal should always be that the people running this process are internal to your company, especially the person leading the process and facilitating it and being responsible for its iteration and making it better over time, process improvement, because it's like a microcosm of running your business. You have all these functions together, everyone's trying to work together, and there's a lot of data and understanding about the specific business and its products and stuff that is really helpful over time. It would be like you don't want to outsource your CEO, at least for not for very long. So it's kind of like that concept.
Yeah.
But it is really helpful if what I would say is look at your team skill sets first, a leadership team or a leader, maybe an ops leader, supply chain leader, that sales leader that's like, hey, I think this could really benefit my company. Start to look into what is sales and operations planning at a basic level, understand a little bit more about the process, and then look and see, do you think you have the right skills in terms of communication, somebody that could lead this process, somebody that the data analytics skills within each function, like I mentioned, and you may find some gaps there. And so those could be two places where you may bring in some temporary help. And then also implementing it from scratch. If you don't already have the process up and running, it is really helpful to have somebody that has run the process before in different companies come in and be able to tell you this is how you should start, because it's really, really easy to do too much too soon. I do that all the time, and I've done it myself. Usually the lesson that I've learned is you want to see all these different things. Oh, this is great. You learn about the concept of the process and you're like, this is going to solve all of our problems. And you do too much too soon to where you can't use the data you're looking at. People get confused, lose interest in the process. They're not seeing the benefit because you're just trying to look at too much too soon. So it is really helpful to have somebody that understands change management. This is a process about bringing people together. All of that is really helpful. And then once you get the process going and people understand the benefits over a few months, taking it back into your own company is the most beneficial thing.
Perfect. So according to you, what are some of the back office stuff that you can outsource that won't really damage the internal process? Stuff like jobs that you think would be better?
Yeah, definitely building data tools. I would say, especially if your company has some basic rigor around data maintenance and you're using an ERP or MRP system, even at a basic level, that's great. If you don't have the internal capacity for somebody to build a Power BI report or an Excel tool, those sorts of things are great to outsource. And then in addition to somebody that can help you implement the process and teach your people what the process is so that it can then be taken on internally. I've actually acted as more of a back office kind of S&OP for companies, helping them implement it where their leadership team comes to me and they're like, we want to implement this process. I train them on what it means and then train them on how to communicate it, give them the tools, the PowerPoints, the exam discussion points for them to then actually just go train the rest of their team that's going to run the process and build the tools. And so I'm more of a back end, what I would think of as a pure consultant type of role where they're truly just consulting me on what do they need to do next versus me going in there and starting the process for them physically. So those are a couple of things that are beneficial that could be kind of more back end you could hire temporarily.
Perfect. When you're dealing with so many, like now you have an internal team, you have an external team, you have different areas coming together. There's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of different types of people, different types of personality. But then now you're also putting the cultural thing into the mix. So there's a lot of cultural challenges as well. So what is a fun story where you've faced the biggest cultural challenge when you were scaling S&OP? It can be a startup, it can be any company. Would love to hear something.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this will be funny at all. But the first thing that comes to mind is there was a company that I worked with on S&OP, and they had a bunch of different locations that were on different ERP systems. They were basically a company that was a conglomeration of other companies. So, this happens a lot in aerospace. I'm sure
Yeah.
it happens in a lot of other industries, right? Where you'll start with one company and then that buys another and it buys another. And now you're like,
Yeah.
you're all one company, but you're really 5 companies. Culturally, they weren't yet at the place of thinking that they're all one company. There was also an added challenge of a lot of different leaders. There was a lot of leadership turnover. A leader would come in, they'd have a great vision, they would communicate it to everybody. Everybody would have process improvement projects of like, this
Yeah.
is what we need to do in each function, and you're going to be responsible for this project, and we're going to report it up, and it would get going. And then the leader would change or get distracted and they would not follow
Yeah.
up on that. And
Yeah.
so people had this history but there were still a lot of people that had been there a long time. They had seen all of this history of the leadership changes. And so they were numb to,
The
I
changes.
come in and I'm like, we're going to start an S&OP process. They're like, we've actually done that before. And it didn't
Yeah.
work. So
Yeah.
they're like, cool, good luck. And I'm like,
No,
no,
I feel
we're
like
gonna do it.
you can do it.
Yeah, I need
Yeah.
you. And they're like, I don't know if you actually need me because we tried it before and then we all gave up and nobody cared that we gave up. That was a really hard environment to implement S&OP, but they still have an S&OP process, which I'm very proud of. It was really just sticking with it over time and being the one that sometimes I had to be the one if a leadership change was happening, like, this is so important. And then come to the new leader and be like, this is why this is important. Can you please support this? And hold people accountable. They were great people. It really wasn't the people. And they were competent, but they had this repetition of nobody caring if they did a good job. Somebody,
Yeah.
from the leadership team asking them to do something, they did it. And then the leadership team didn't acknowledge it or care or follow up. They did get a really great leadership team as well. So that obviously helped a lot as well, where they were following up and holding people accountable to things. But it really just took persistence. Like, you just got to keep doing the same thing over and over again, and you got to keep listening. I had a lot of interesting conversations.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And that's why I say it's funny because I've heard so many stories along the way where the cultural thing is actually a really big challenge, but usually it's just hearing them out and sticking with it.
Yes.
Like they're just looking for consistency and persistence. Well, it's been such a great conversation. I really hate to end it, but I'm going to still ask you one more question because I know we're
Okay.
out of time. What's that one mindset shift that you think leaders need to adopt in S&OP very early on in your career? You probably learned a little later, but now with AI and everything in place, what's that one thing, or let's do 3 things, 3 things that you think?
Yeah. Okay. So I would say first, in terms of mindset of S&OP, I would say to think of it as a decision-making process. That's really what it's intended to be. It is a data-driven process, but it can quickly become like, we're doing data analytics here, and it's all about the data analytics. The meetings become about discussing the data itself, not in a way of what decisions are we making, but like, what is this data and why is the logic that way? All of that stuff needs to happen in the background. The mindset of the leadership team should be that I want to be going to these meetings to make decisions that benefit us a year and a half to 3 years out. We're trying to reduce our supply risk and meet our financial plan for the next few years. That's really what the process should be, a decision-making process, which again means it's about people. We need to not forget that this is about bringing people together. So those things matter, of executive leadership, sponsorship, of paying attention to listening to people that are having a challenge with being a part of the process, and being persistent. It's about people. Another thing I would say is around the data piece, and we kind of touched on a little bit, is don't do too much too fast. It really is valuable to do something basic in Excel first, and then figure out, now that we've done something really basic, it could be really painful to do it in Excel. It could be really manual and very painful. But if it's something like your rough cut capacity and you're a manufacturer, you have to know that. You have to just start it, and it's going to be painful. It's going to be manual, but then you're going to learn as you start to try to use that information and that Excel tool, how do we need to change the logic? What do the visuals need to look like so that we can actually make decisions off this data? We'll parse all of these things out over hopefully just a few months, and then you'll understand what tool do we need for this. Is it Power BI, or does it have to be interactive and maybe Power BI isn't great for this? So starting off simple, but starting with something and not just saying we don't have the tool, but building something manual and then trying to make it more efficient over time is really valuable, because there are all these amazing things like AI tools and the scenario planning tools can be really amazing, but you have to have step changes to get there. You can't just go from 0 to that.
Exactly. Perfect.
Yes, one more.
Loving it. One more.
The third one, mindset shifts. Oh, we said the data part, start simple. And then we said, think of this as a decision-making process. The last part I would say is about the people. One thing I haven't really talked about in that regard is that sometimes what I'll see is that people are resistant to it because they actually don't have the skills, meaning like they don't understand how to look at data even in Excel. Or maybe it's a company that has more fancy tools and they just don't understand where to start with what's in the system, where does it come from, and things like that. That's another mindset shift, just really to pay more attention to what people are saying and trying to understand why. Really, that they just don't want to do something, or more likely, is it that they just don't have the skills and feel uncomfortable? That's a really big piece too, especially in this kind of process, because if you don't already have planning roles that look out in the medium term, then you are probably going to have people that have never done that and they're only comfortable with that more execution type planning, and they need help understanding how to look at data, how to look at that much data at once, like very easy to go into the weeds. So there's a lot of things around data analytics basics that really aren't very hard to train and get people to understand the concept of, and then they got to practice it and then it'll click, right? But these are things that aren't hard for you to make people aware of and train on. So I would say that's another thing around people.
Lindsay, it was so great having this conversation with you. Such great examples and such clear things that you have taught us today. I'm really excited for this episode to go live, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Cynthia, I appreciate the time. A great
Same here.
conversation.
Thank you so much. Same here. You have a good day.